What's going on, guys? My name's Kev, and so far in 2025, I've made more than $100,000 with my AI SaaS companies, StockTalk AI, Clonify.app, and my newest app, SocialWolf.io. And in this video, I'm going to give you the Replit Masterclass because all three of those apps were built entirely using just the Replit Agent. And in this video, we're going to cover A to Z how I build applications, launch them, and make them profitable just using the Replit Agent. We're going to talk about databases. We're going to talk about API integrations, Stripe integrations, deploying, limitations, and how to actually get around the problems that you run into when you're developing with AI no code. People like to talk about vibe coding, but the reality is if you want to build something that is genuinely worth millions of dollars, you're going to have to struggle. It's not going to be easy, but in this video, my goal is to give you the exact blueprint that you can follow to genuinely launch apps. In today's video, guys, what we're going to be building is an AI podcast app. And through this process, I'm just going to show you all the different things that I've learned while developing with the Replit Agent so that you can build your apps as fast as humanly possible. So we have 7 steps from going from 0 to MVP that we're going to go through in this video. But what I also want to talk about is just the quick rundown of what the Replit Agent is if you've never heard about it. So what Replit allows you to do is using their agent and assistant AI models, you can build any no-code app you can fucking think of. On top of that, they have built-in databases, built-in authentication, and a ton of built-in tools to help you integrate all of these new features to your application. And so we're going to go through that step by step. So guys, we landed on step 1, which is idea validation. And basically what I do is I look for competitors just by browsing on social media organically. And when I find something that is interesting enough to me, I go and I do a back-end research to see if I can actually build what they built. And in this example, guys, we're building an AI podcast generator. What that means when we're validating the idea is I want to see if there's any competitors out there that are creating AI podcasts, and B, if there's any APIs that I can use to actually make this come true. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to do a little bit of research. So I'm going to hop into the computer and I'm literally just going to go to Perplexity. And so now that we're in Perplexity, this AI model is able to search the web. And so what I'm going to ask it is basically any API models that can basically create this AI podcast that I want. And so we're just going to type that in now. We're going to go, I want to create an AI podcast application. Are there any APIs I can use for this app? And we're just going to send that in. And we just got 7 responses of potential API suitors that we can use for our application. We have Podcastle, Google Gemini, OpenAI, PlayHT, blah, 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 blah. After doing some research, we're going to go ahead with the PlayHT API because it is exactly what we wanted, right? So now that we know that the PlayHT API is the one that we're going to use, let's go and get those keys that we need. So we're going to go type in PlayHT API in the search, and now we're going to head over to the PlayHT website. So now we're in the website, we're going to go and log in. I already have an account, so we're going to go and grab that account, but basically this is exactly what you would do. Now that we're logged into the PlayHT website, we can go and grab our API keys. So these are the API keys that we would be using in our calls. So now that we know that the application is going to be possible, we can move forward with actually planning out the build. A lot of people skip this part with doing research. Now, SocialWolf, for example, has 15 different APIs that I had to go and research before even starting the build. And so this is an example of how you would do your research to make sure that you can actually build out the application. So now that we have this API, we can move on to our next step. So step 2, guys, is the tech stack. So in the tech stack, we're going to identify what type of coding language we want to build and why. And so in this example, guys, we're going to be building a web application. Now on Replit, I recommend only 2 different types of coding languages. If you're building a web application, most likely you just want to use Next.js as your base coding language. If you're building for a mobile application, I recommend using React Native because React Native can work for both Android and Apple devices so that you can get as much reach as humanly possible with your mobile app. Both of those coding languages can work within Replit, and they have this beautiful thing called Expo that allows you to actually build the mobile app within Replit. So absolutely wonderful. And if we want to take things a step further, I'm going to be making a video in the future where I'm going to be making a full 3D video game. And so if I was building a 3D video game in this project, I would also need to find a 3D coding language to actually help me build that out. 3.js, Abalon.js, JavaScript frameworks, Play Canvas. There's a whole bunch of different coding languages that we can add for 3D game development as well. So these are the different options that you have. We're going to move forward with Next.js, and so that is step 2. Now, step 3, guys, is planning out your actual roadmap to getting to MVP. There's 2 different things you need to jot down and prepare for when you're building out your project. So the first one that we want to talk about, guys, are the actual steps needed to achieve MVP. And so with the podcast project, guys, our goal is to allow users to create AI generated podcasts of any context that they want. They put in the script and they get out an AI podcast. And so what I wrote in this Google Docs are the step-by-step instructions that I need to do to achieve this goal. And when you're building anything with an AI coder, you're going to want to implement the features step by step. Now, AI coding is mind-blowing, and I can't even believe that this is a reality, but they're still not perfect. They're still going to hallucinate, and there's still going to be a lot of mistakes. And in today's video, I'm going to also break down how you can roll back and how you can fix these problems when you run into them. For now, all I want to talk to you about is just getting prepared to getting the project started. So now that we have the steps to MVP, the second thing that we need to think about is the database design or the database architecture. We're going to look at this simple database storage setup. And this is something that I'm thinking about before I actually build my project, because we have to instruct the AI model to actually build out these different tables in our database. And so in our podcast application, there's going to be 3 main tables. There's going to be a users table, a usage table, and the podcast generated table. So when a user signs in, we need to store their email, username, password, and then when they subscribe, we need to store their subscription status, Stripe ID, customer ID, expiry date, so on and so forth. With the usage, we need to track the amount of tokens that the users are actually using per podcast generation. Let's say the free plan can only use 10,000 characters worth of tokens, where the elite plan can use up to 500,000 characters worth of tokens every single month. We need to be able to also track this so that the paying users can get those increased limits. And last but not least, guys, we need to actually store the podcast generated by the users so that they can actually see all of the different podcasts that they have generated using our application. And so these are the 3 different storage components that we're going to be building out for this initial application. So now that we understand the steps that we need and how the database is going to look, we can start thinking about step 4. So guys, step 4 is when you essentially begin. This is your first prompt to the agent to start building out your project. And it's very important how you actually write out this initial prompt, because it lays down the foundation for how the AI model thinks about your project. And so when I lay out my initial prompts, I never actually implement any features. We do features step by step. So when we do this initial prompt, the main goal is to just get the framework built out. The initial pages you need, the name of the application, the sign in and sign up form, and then we'll move forward. So that's exactly what we're going to do now. All right, guys, so I said I'm building an AI podcast generator app using PlayHT's API. I want you to build this application using Next.js, and I want to build the first initial pages. So page 1, home screen and a get started button. Page 2, the sign in and sign up page, and page 3, the AI podcast generator page. I asked it to please build this out, and then we'll go step by step. Now, when you're building out your first prompt, you can also click this improve prompt, which will structure this initial prompt even better for the AI model to understand. And so once this improved prompt is set up, we are now going to click the start building and we'll get things going. Okay, awesome. So whenever the AI model gives you this type of form where it gives you these other additional options to add on top of the thing that you asked for, always just check off the first one. This ties back to not wanting to confuse the model, only doing things step by step, because these AI models are best when you do things one at a time instead of all at once. And so we're just going to choose that first one and approve the plan. All right, guys, so now that we made our first prompt with the agent and it created the initial infrastructure, I just want to go on a little bit of a tangent here to explain everything you need to know about the Replit agent versus the Replit assistant before we move forward. So the Replit agent, think of it as the all-in-one super developer agent that can do any type of task that you need. And we use this agent to do the high-level tasks, whether that's incorporating API features, incorporating database updates, fetching fetching database data. We do all of this and we structure it with our agent. And so we do that in this agent chat. The other thing about the agent is that it keeps track of the entire chat, and you're able to roll back to any moment in the chat while you don't exit out of the current chat that you're in. Right now, we're in our first agent chat. We're able to roll back to any moment in time that we want to. Why is this important? Well, if you reach a point where the agent starts hallucinating and messes up your code, it's going to be very difficult for you to prompt engineer your way back to fixing the application. The easiest way is to just roll back. And so you always want to make sure that before you open up a new agent chat, you are in a position where you're comfortable with your project. Because if you start a new chat and you're not in a good place with your project, you're not going to be able to roll back, and then you're in a very tricky situation. Now, why would you even want to start a new chat with the agent? Well, over time, as you start having conversations that extend over days, the chat window is going to get way too long, and the agent's going to take too much time to update different features. And that's going to slow down your actual development progress. And so you're going to want to refresh the chat every $10 or $20 or so. Now, the agent costs 25 cents per completion, and that's another reason why we want to use the agent to do the super high level tasks. It takes a little bit of time, but it also gets the job done, and it makes sure that it actually gets it done before it shows you for the most part. It's around 90% of the time that it gets the tasks done on its first try. Now here we have the assistant. Now the assistant is also extremely powerful, especially since Replit added Claude 3.7 to the assistant model. This thing can basically do as much as the agent, but we really like to use the assistant for minor tweaks or minor UI tweaks. You guys are going to see that in today's video, but I'm going to use this mainly for these little tweaks because it moves a lot faster than the agent, but it can't do as high level tasks as the agent. So we use this for UI. So guys, after our first prompt, the agent did complete the entire landing page that we wanted to. We let it basically handle the errors that it did on its own. And by the time we got the prompt back, we have this completed project. So we're just going to click run to see what we got cooking so far. Okay, awesome. So a very simple landing page. Now we want to go back to the steps tab and we want to see exactly what we want to do in order. So we already built the initial UI. Now let's build the sign in and sign up page. So here on Replit, we have the sign in button. We're going to click that. And as we can see, they already have the initial login and register fields, but there is no email field in the register forms. And so that's going to literally be our next update. I'm just going to tell the assistant to add an email field because it's a very small UI change. All right, guys, so I just sent in the prompt to add an email to the form, and within a couple of seconds, it's able to now implement this for us, and we can go and apply the code. If this was the agent, that would have taken an extra couple of minutes for no reason. And as we can see here, it immediately added the email field. And so when this reloads, we're now going to be able to register with our actual email. So now when we can register this, we'll go back and we'll check that off. So we're going to go test user 1 and test user 1 at gmail.com. Okay, cool. So now I was able to sign in, and there's this podcast form that it's already kind of built out for us. So it's already done it's basically done everything that we needed so far in terms of the initial UI of the application. And so now that we signed in and signed up, we can cross that off and move on to our next task, which is adding the APIs to the project. And so the first thing we want to do is just tell the AI to add the APIs to its secrets. And so a secrets in Replit is exactly like an environment file in any other IDE that you've ended up using, whether it's VS Code, Cursor, any other, Bolt, any of these other ones. But they use secrets because you can store all of them in your account and you can just pass them over to the app that you're working on. It essentially just streamlines your process to store all your API keys and then allow the ones that you want to use for your project. And so in this application, guys, we're going to be using the PlayHT APIs. And so we're going to go back to PlayHT, and we see that there's two API keys or two different types of credentials. There's the user ID and the secret key. And so we know that we need to use both of these credentials to actually make the API call work. And so that's the next thing we're going to tell the AI. And so we're going to stick with the assistant here, and I'm going to go, that worked well. Now I want to add my API keys for PlayHT to the secrets. PlayHT gave me a user ID and an API key. right? So this is very simple, step by step. We're just going to send in this next prompt, and what it should do is it should start building out a new secrets tab or new secrets sections that allow me to input the PlayHT APIs. And so here in the prompt response from the assistant, it tells us exactly how we should name these API keys within our secrets environment. So I'm just going to copy the PlayHT user ID and I'm going to paste that in. Then I'm going to go back to PlayHT. I'm going to grab my user ID and I'm going to paste it into that field. Okay, so now that that's there, I'm going to click add secret. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing with the API key. So we're going to go copy this API key and how it's formatted. Then we're going to go to new secret, paste that in. We're going to go grab the secret key and we're going to paste that in. And so now it has all of the API keys that we need for the application to actually make the API call. So we're going to stop the application and we're going to run it so it now has these keys in the actual app while it's running, and we can now instruct it on how we want this to actually work. So if we go back to the steps here, we can cross off API keys added to project, and now we need to actually build out the podcast page. And it already started it for us from our initial prompt, right? So we can now log in with that account. Okay, so now that we're back in on the podcast form, we need to now structure this podcast form to actually work with our API call. So the first thing we want to do is actually look at the documents of our API call. And this is how we're going to instruct the agent to learn how this API call actually works. This is a very important step because this is how I actually teach the agent to implement API calls for all of my applications. So for this example, guys, we're doing the PlayHT podcast. So we're going to open up the API documentation. Guys, so now that we're in the API docs for Play AI, we can go and find the podcast feature so we can show the AI model how to implement the API call. So here in the guides, we can see it says, create an AI podcast with multiple hosts using the Play dialog. So we're going to click on that and we're going to see exactly what the API call looks like. And we can use this to actually teach our AI model how to make the API call. So we're going to go and find the exact example and we're going to use that. Okay, guys, so after going through the Play AI documentation, I found out the next step that we need to do. And that step is adding all of these voices that are in Play AI to our application. And so that's the next step that we need to add here. In the build podcast page, we can actually add another tab that says add voices to choose from, and then add functionality. So the first thing we want to do is add the voices to choose from. Okay, guys, so after doing a little bit more deep diving, I found the proper URL that we can use to actually call to get all of the right voices. And so this URL right here is actually where we get all of the voices. And so before we move on, I'm actually going to go back to the agent and tell it, that looks decent. You can get all of the actual voices for this feature at this URL endpoint on Play AI. And we're going to send that in. So now we're going to say, please add these voices to the create new podcast form correctly. And here I'm going to say, tell me your understanding, implement, and I'll check it out. We're going to send that in. Now, hopefully it'll get all the voices and then we can move on to the next step of getting this feature to work. Okay, so here it's starting to tell us its understanding. So it says, looking at the new voices documentation, I notice each voice has additional metadata, accent, age, style. The voices are better organized with clear categorization. We should update our voice interface to include these new fields. Okay, so we're back on the form here. Let's see, we drop it down and now we have an absolutely beautiful breakdown of all the different voices that I was talking about. And we can choose from them and choose different voices to conversate with one another. So that's off to a great start. Another cool thing is that it adds the age and if it's a conversational voice or a narrative voice. And so we use different voices for different tasks. And so we're going to use the conversational voices for the podcast feature, obviously. So now that's starting to look good and we can move on to actually getting the podcast form to work now. And so we're going to say, yes, that looks great. Now let's implement the actual podcast API call. This is the docs. And so The difficult thing about adding the API call is that you're going to have to show an example of the API call and potentially the docs. And so I'm going to show you exactly how that works. So now we're going to go into the Create an AI podcast. And so here we have the docs that tells you how to build the AI podcast. We're going to go and find the code example that has JavaScript code. And so since our project is in JavaScript, we want to find the example, which is right here, that is the JavaScript API call. And so what we're going to do is we're going to copy this API call and we're going to paste it into our Replit Agent chat. And so I'm going to say, yes, that looks great. Now let's implement the actual API call. This is the call to generate a podcast with the voices we added to the form. And then we're going to paste in the API call, right? And so in this example, we don't have to do get text content or take screenshot because it's already laid out there. But what we also want to do is actually give it the docs. And so we gave it the API call, but we also want to give it the docs. And so we're going to go back to the place that we got that code from, and we're just going to copy the URL. We're going to go back to Replit and we're going to paste in the URL. And this URL, we want to click get text content. So once that loads up, it now has the text content from the API call docs, and it has the API call example. Before sending this in, we're going to say, tell me your understanding, implement, and I'll test the API, test the podcast feature. So it ended up adding the update. We're going to go see if it works, but its response to us was everything that we wanted it to do. So it's making a post request to the Play AI API call to actually make the podcast. It's going to send the selected voices and the proper formatting and blah, 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 blah. So let's see if this actually works. Okay, so we're going to choose voice 1 and voice 2. And we can already tell that this is not going to work because there needs to be certain fields that get passed in the content box. So one thing that we're going to do is go back to the Play AI API call, and we're going to explain that it needs to have a layout so that it can show voice 1, voice 2, voice 1, voice 2 when the API call is being made. So the text box needs to have that laid out as well. Okay, so here we are back in the API. Here we are back in the Play AI docs, and here is the text example where it shows how the API call needs to be made, where it goes speaker 1, blah, 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 and then speaker 2, blah, 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 speaker 1, blah, 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 blah. And so what we're going to do is we're going to just copy this text here, and we're going to explain that this is how the format of the API call needs to be made. So the content box here needs to look like that. So we're going to say, this looks good, but we need to structure the content box to show the speaker 1, speaker 2 separators. So the API call produces a natural speaking conversation between two AI voices. This is what the sample API call would look like in the text field, and then we paste that in. Therefore, the content box on our form needs to have the format already laid out, so the user sends in the proper API formatting. And so we're just going to go send that in. All right, guys, so now is another step in the development process, which is absolutely crucial. And this is trial and error until your API calls work or your feature that you're implementing works. And we do this by using the console as well, because what the console does is it actually shows you the API calls that are being made if you add what's called logs. And what logs are basically just information that can be shown to you that is what's happening on the behind the scenes. And so when an API call is failing, you can add logs to the console to see what the API call structure is, to actually see if the call structure is what the API call wants, and then you can basically debug it and fix it from there. And so here we got the update back from the AI that says, can you test the generation with the two different voices and see if the audio plays correctly? And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to test that. Now, most likely it's not going to work. And what I just told you is how we're going to debug this. So we're going to sign in. And so here we have the actual example of what this should look like. And so what we're going to do is we're going to copy that example and we're going to paste it in just to see how this is working. And we're going to write, hey man, this is just a test. And then we're going to let the rest of the conversation go naturally, right? So, hey man, this is just a test. No, what happened? Well, they just announced blah, blah, blah. That's fascinating. So we're going to grab some voices. So the first voice we'll grab is Angelo, and the second voice we'll grab is Timo. And we're going to click generate podcast. And so here it said failed to generate podcast, which is a very simple message. But if we go inside the console, we can see at least a little bit of the API call that was made so far. And so actually looking at the console, we can see that the API call didn't happen at all. And so another way that we can look inside of the console is by clicking the dev tools. And the dev tools is going to show us some more information about the error. And so here we can actually copy and paste this error to the AI model to actually fix this problem. And so what I'm going to do is I'm literally just going to copy this code and then we're just going to paste it in. And so here it has the entire, error message, and I'm just going to explain what happened. So I'm going to say, when I clicked the generate podcast button, we got an error. This was the message in the console. Now what we're going to tell the agent to do is add the logs in the console so I can see the API call, because we couldn't see the API call in the console yet. And so now I'm going to say add logs for the generate podcast API call so I can help debug in the console. And we're going to send that in. All right, guys, so we just got the newest update back. Let's see if it's working. Okay, so again, I'm just going to click two voices and we're going to send in the API call. And so now we're getting an error that says content is required. And so I'm going to again send in that message because the API call is still not happening. I'm just literally going to say, when I clicked generate podcast, nothing happened, but there were already 4 messages in the podcast I wanted to make. And then we're actually going to take a screenshot of the actual error and we're going to send that in. So it understands that, hey, we actually filled out the generate podcast field and you're now telling me that content is required, but I already put in the content. So hopefully that makes it understand that. Telling us to enter our own conversation and click the generate podcast. So I'm going to add new text to that field and we're going to see what happens. Okay, so I just wrote up a quick little speaker 1, speaker 2 conversation, and we're just going to send in the API call with 2 voices. And here we got a real message. And so now it says the provided user doesn't exist, doesn't have an API call. So now we can actually grab that message and we can send it in. So this is much better. So once again, I'm copying and pasting that error, but now I'm going to send in a message that says, we got a new error. It looks like the API key was not being passed properly. Make sure you're passing the keys from the secrets. This was the error message. Fix this and I'll try again. And we're just going to send that in. To be honest, this is actually a good example because this podcast feature is quite difficult compared to most API calls. And this is why it's not that simple to implement. And I need to actually show you how to implement the harder features, because if you're able to implement something like the AI podcast, and then after we implement it, I'm going to show you how to do the tracking and make sure that, the token tracking works for all the different users, then you guys can pretty much implement any API call that you would want. And so this is why this is the Replit Masterclass, because I'm not just showing you how to implement an API, how to implement this. It's every single step in the process that you need to launch your own fucking SaaS. So, okay, let's sign in one more time. This is tedious, guys, but this is how to develop. This is how to actually develop with AI. So Guys, we're back. I had a community call with the No Code Academy, and now let's continue to work on this API integration. So we just got the message back from the agent that said the update came through. So I'm just going to quickly register with another account, and we're going to send in our first podcast request here to see if it actually goes through. And so here we see that there's a little bit of formatting issues. So I'm just going to quickly clean up this formatting. Okay, so now we're just going to select a couple of voices and send this in. Okay, so it says your podcast has been generated successfully, but as you guys can see here, I'm not able to actually play the audio. So what I'm gonna do first is I'm gonna go into the console so I can actually see what's going on. If you guys remember in our previous message with the agent, I told it to add logs for the API call, and now we can see everything that's going on with the API call behind the scenes, and we can see what's actually going wrong. And so on the front end, it told us that the podcast was created, but looking at the console here, I can see that the API call was created, but the status was still in progress. And so it sent us back a missing URL because the progress of the actual podcast wasn't created. And so since this is happening, it means that the creation of the response doesn't happen immediately. And since the creation doesn't happen immediately, we need to poll and continuously check in at this API call to see when this status goes from in progress to completed. And so this usually takes somewhere from 10 seconds to a couple of minutes, depending on how long the call is and how long, in this example, the AI podcast is going to be. And so the way we can fix this to actually get the URL back when it's completed is by letting the agent know that we need to do polling every 5 seconds to check for the end result. And so that's what this prompt is going to be here. So I'm going to say, looking at the logs, the API call for the podcast generation was made successfully. But the podcast generation takes some time to complete. Therefore, I want you to send a poll to the podcast endpoint every 3 seconds until the podcast status goes from in progress to the completed status state. Cool. And so now before sending in this prompt, I'm actually going to send it what I saw in the console. And so I'm going to grab what I saw in the console where it said API success and the URL was missing. So I'm literally just going to copy and paste that in. And I'm going to say, we need to wait until we get the URL to let the user play back and download their podcast. So we just sent in that message and we're going to see if the agent's able to handle this request. Okay, so now we just implemented the polling mechanism. So hopefully it can now send in the request and we get back the podcast once it gets completed. So let's sign in and let's check this out. So we're just gonna grab a voice. Let's go Briggs, let's go Cillian, and then let's just grab this example conversation and let's click generate podcast. So this time it's now saying generation started, which is obviously a great sign. We can hop into the console and we can see what's going on here. We can now see that the status text says created and we have the status still saying in progress, but at the bottom here, the API is polling every 3 seconds, as we can see. Now, something also interesting to point out are these codes on the right-hand side. These codes indicate whether the call is in progress or successful. And this 200 response here means that we actually got the podcast response pretty fast. And for some reason, it's still doing the polling. And so this is an error that we need to fix. But if we head back to our page, we can see that our podcast has been generated successfully, but there is an error where it keeps generating new podcasts. So we do have to fix that, but let's just see how this sounds.
Hey, did you hear about the latest?
That sounds pretty good, and it seems like this audio is getting cut off by all of these new success generations popping up. So we're going to let the AI know that the podcast generation worked, but the polling kept happening after the response was made. So now we just need to fix this little issue. So one thing to note here in this debug is that I'm just telling the AI model to check the logs, which is the console, because that's where the error is occurring. So it just knows where to go and look. So it's very simple prompt here, and we're just going to send that in. And hopefully after this update, the AI podcast is completely finished and we can work on our next real big task, which is learning how to incorporate the database. All right, guys, so now let's hope that the polling mechanism stops when we create our podcast so that we can move forward with our next step. So I'm gonna quickly log in and we'll test this one more time. Awesome, so we're just gonna copy in the example here, paste it in. We're gonna grab a couple voices. Let's see what we got here. Let's grab Cillian, the Irish accent, and let's pair that up with an African-American accent, and let's generate this podcast. We'll see. And as you see here, we got the podcast successfully generated. And if we look in the console, we can see that the polling has stopped. So now everything's working really, really well. Let's see what the podcast actually sounds like.
Hey, did you hear about the latest tech news?
No, what happened?
Well, they just announced.
That's fascinating.
Okay, so pretty good. It works. And so now we've officially implemented a very difficult API feature. But this is not where the fun ends. We have to now add the entire database logic to our application. And so before we move forward with any other features or any other steps, let's see where we are in our journey. So we built our initial UI. We did the sign in and sign up pages. We added the API keys for our feature. We built the podcast page, we added the voices to choose from, and now we've added the functionality. Now, the next thing we need to do, guys, is build all of the database tables that are needed for our project. And so if we go back into our presentation, we can see the 3 tables that we want to build: the users, the usage, and the podcast. And so since this is one database update, I'm going to take a risk here and I'm going to try and get it all done in one shot with the Replit agent, because we're only working on one thing, which is the database. And so here I'm going to paste in everything that I want to be added to the database. Awesome. Now we want to start using the database. The database needs to have 3 tables: users, usage, and podcast generations. In the users table, we are storing the user's username, email, password, Stripe customer ID, plan account status, which would be either free, pro, or elite, expires at date, and we'll move on to the next table. So then we'll say the usage table needs to track the tokens used in the podcast, in the AI podcast generation feature. This will help us limit users based on their plans. The third table needs to be called generated podcasts. This table will store all the users' podcast generations, and we will display them on a separate page in the application. First thing I want you to do is build out these tables in the database. So we're going to get the tables built first, and then I'm going to explain to the AI how it's going to store the data. And so it's really cool because you can always access your database. So while this is happening, I'm just going to show you this real quick. So this elephant emoji here is your database. And as you guys can see, it just opened up our database. We have no tables built so far, and that's exactly what the agent is going to do in this step. So we're going to check back in when the agent gives us its checkpoint, and we're going to see if it built out the tables that I wanted it to. Here we can see it's executing these SQL queries. And so why would you ever build a database when you can just tell AI to build it for you? I mean, look at this. It's literally building out every single table that we could possibly need. And I showed you guys what the actual infrastructure looks like. So this is what you actually need to learn. This right here is understanding how the flow of your database will actually go into the project. You don't even really need to understand how a PostgreSQL database works. You just need to know how the flow for the users will work. That's why creating a very simple illustration like this is a game changer by the time you get into the trenches. Because when you're into the trenches and you're balls deep into a project and your database is all messy, it's going to be very hard to recover. Okay, so the update I got back, it says I've successfully created all 3 databases. So now we can go into the database, click see my data, and we can see that we have the generated podcasts, the usage, and the users fields. And so now I'm going to say, I'm going to sign up with the user and see if it stores all the information. Okay, cool. So now it says we can now register accounts and it'll add it to the database. So we're going to go register this user. So register1 at gmail.com. Now let's register. So it says that we have registered. Let's go look at the database. We'll go into users and we'll refresh the table. And we can see that now the username, email, and password have been added. And there's the Stripe customer ID, the plan status, expires at, created at, and all of that fun stuff added to the table. So that's really cool. Now, the next thing we want to work on is the usage table. And so what the usage table is going to do is it's going to keep track of all the tokens that are used in the podcast that is generated. And so if a user is a free plan, for example, we can now set usage limits for that plan. And then if they reach that limit, we can then prompt them to go and subscribe and upgrade their plan so we can make some money. And so in this example, we're going to limit the free plan to 5,000 tokens, and we want to see if it's actually tracking the usage. And so here's how I'm going to write this prompt out. Okay, cool. The users are being added correctly. Now let's work on the usage table. This table will track and insert the tokens used in a podcast generation for a user. We need to make sure we are tracking the total tokens used for a user in the usage table. Explain your understanding, implement, and then I will test a new podcast generation to see if the usage token amount was stored. We're just going to send in that prompt. All right, guys, so we just got the update back with the token usage. So it's saying it's going to start tracking the usage in the table in our database. So let's run a quick podcast test to see if it's actually tracking. And let's do it with a brand new user as well. So let's go name this account DeepSeek and let's register. Okay, so there's this weird pop-up that keeps happening that says configuration error because it's working. So I don't know why that pop-up's happening, but anyways, let's now run a quick test and see if the tokens are actually being stored. So here we have our test example again. We're going to run the podcast. It says generation started, and let's see what happens when we get the response back. So okay, so your podcast generated successfully, and we can see in the console that it's not looping through the polling, so that's good. Let's give it a quick listen.
Hey, did you hear about the latest tech news?
Okay, so it's working well. Now let's go inside the database. Here we're in usage. Let's refresh the usage table. And there you go, guys. It perfectly counted the tokens used for that specific podcast generation, and it stored it under the user ID of that specific user. And so now we can start tracking the actual usages of users. And so that actually worked very, very well. That was almost a one-shot. Now let's quickly do the generated podcasts as well. Oh, I didn't even tell it to do that. And it has actually stored the generated podcasts. So as you guys can see here, the generated podcasts have been stored. That is absolutely wonderful. Now we can add another page to our application that allows users to actually look at all of their podcasts that they've generated with that third table. And the crazy thing is we didn't tell it how to do that. We just told it that we wanted that table. So that is unbelievable. And now we can go back to our progression and we can see that all the databases have been built out. And since the usage is tracking, the complete podcast functionality is now complete. We have set up usage tracking. And so here we are more than halfway through to MVP. And so the next few things here are setting up user plans, setting up payments, and then testing the usage and the plans. And so I've done this in multiple videos where I showed you guys how to connect Stripe to your application and how to test it to make sure that you're receiving payments correctly. And so there's a whole tutorial that explains how to to do that, linked down below. And so instead of talking just about setting up the Stripe payment plans, because I already showed you guys how to do that, I actually want to explain how to design your prices, right? And so in this example, we're creating an AI podcast tool. And so the first thing that we got to do when we're setting up the user plans is we got to identify the margins, okay? And we need to see how much money we can possibly generate off of the different price points that we're offering. Let's say this is the only API that we're using, and we can see that this API costs us $20 a month, right? So for us to break even, we need to make more than $20 a month from our application for this app to overall be profitable. And so the way that we can set up our pricing can be very dynamic based off of this very, very low end restriction of $20 a month. We can charge users, let's say, $5 a month for the pro plan to be like 10 or 50,000 podcast tokens, because this $20 price plan also comes with a set amount of tokens. And so if we look at the billing here, we can see that they structure their pricing in terms of minutes produced of podcast time. And so we can divide this by the pro price to see how many members we can get at the price point that we have with our API. And so the way that this makes more sense is we can go 75 minutes divided by 5 minutes of usage per user, right? So with our 75 minutes of available API time divided by 5, we can now sell up to 15 memberships at $20 a month before we would even have to consider upgrading our own plan. And so this would be like our initial price points to start generating some interest and getting some people on board. Now, my own applications like Social Wolf, for example, does this exact same thing. But Social Wolf has multiple APIs. And so this thing becomes more complicated, right? So this would be the AI podcast cost. But then we would also have AI video clone, AI text to speech, uploading videos, editing videos, text to 3D models, text to video models. And all of these different models also have their own tokens and costs associated. And over time, you can see how complex your application can get. But if you just follow the step-by-step instructions, you're going to be able to build as complicated as an app as you possibly could ever want, because you just need to take the step-by-step approach, right? Because right now, we have implemented a very difficult API in reality. We implemented a podcast AI tool that people don't even know exists, right? And so we were able to implement that just with the Replit agent. But now over time, you can continuously make your projects better by adding more and more features. And so the fact that we were able to show you guys this means that you can literally take everything that you learned in this video and go out and build any type of application that you can fucking possibly think of. So we've identified the plans, we've identified sort of where that's going, right? So we're going to figure out that the margins are pretty good with this type of offer, because that's the only thing that we're offering on this example. And then we can actually set up payments and start testing all of that fun stuff, right? And so let's assume that we did all of that because you have all of those tutorials, and we're very close to launching our actual application now. We have users that can get onboarded and sign in and sign up. They can make payments and get payments. Now we just need to touch up the user interface and launch the MVP. And so touching up the user interface is one of the more fun things, and that's actually just design. And so I want to show you guys a quick little hack in terms of what I use to create really cool design websites, and that's 21st Dev. Now what 21st Dev does is it basically allows anyone to add components to 21st Dev that anyone else can just copy and add to their website. And so if I wanted any of these features, I would just go into the feature and copy the prompt. I would then grab that prompt and I would paste it into my Replit agent, and it would go ahead and it would build it for us. And so this is a really quick way to create really high level user interfaces. But another way that you can do this is, let's say there's another competitor that is creating AI podcasts. I can go and grab their website, take screenshots of their website, and send it in to the model as well. And so there's a whole bunch of ways that you can go about the UI design using the agent. But honestly, when we're talking about UI, I would just recommend using the assistant, because it is just as powerful. So now let's get more into the nitty gritty, right? So let's say we were building that AI podcast feature and we were never able to make it work. And on top of that, it actually broke some of the other pieces of my project, and I don't want that to happen. There's a couple of ways that I go around fixing these problems and getting around these problems. So the first way that I go about it is, if I can, I will roll back the agent chat. And so here again, like I was saying earlier in today's video, we can roll back to as early as your first message in an agent's chat window. But the moment that you click the new chat, you can't roll back anymore. So another way that you can save your project in case things get messy is by pushing things to GitHub. Because GitHub is a beautiful place that stores all of your files and no one else can access them. So if you ever need to roll back and you accidentally deleted your agent chat, you can always use GitHub. And so in this example, I've already committed to it, but you can see here that everything that I've been working on for the past session is available. In GitHub, I can go back to the moment I started this project, which is 4 hours ago. But with the agent chat, I can only go back to 1 hour ago. And so having GitHub is super crucial to making sure that you never lose progress, or you can roll back as far back as you want to go. All right, so now we're talking about deploying. So let's head over to the deployments tab in Replit, and I can talk about all the different features here. So when you're actually deploying your application, the best way that I'd recommend doing this is by selecting the auto scale. Now what auto scale does is it uses servers on Replit based on the demand of your application. So you're gonna be charged for the server costs of Replit. It's not that expensive, but if you're getting tens of thousands of users coming to your website every single day, the servers are going to be quite overran, and therefore you do the auto scale so it can actually handle that demand. But then when there's hours in the day where there's less demand, you don't want to use up all that compute power, which will cost you a lot of money, so then it scales back down. And so this is the beautiful thing about the deployment within Replit, but I want to show you guys a real deployed app with Replit so you guys get a better understanding. So we're going to go into Social Wolf here, and we're going to enter into the deployments. And so here we can actually see every single one of my deployments over the course of this entire project. It goes back to a whole month ago, and it took me an entire month to build this full stack application. But you can see here that the application has been deployed online to my public production websites. And the way that I did that was, whenever you want to actually add a website, whether you bought it on Replit, bought it on GoDaddy, bought it somewhere else, is just clicking this link a domain button. You would then add in your URL. So let's say in this example, I want to add socialwolf.io, and you would then add these records to your DNS settings. Very straightforward stuff. And once that connects, it literally just works seamlessly. So what you guys just witnessed was A to Z production building from zero to MVP, going from an idea to a full-on working application with nothing but the Replit agent. What I showed you in this video is exactly what I do on a day in, day out basis, and this is exactly what has helped me generate over $100,000 this year, and we're just getting started. Now, if you guys want to actually see my journey of how I'm growing my software on a day in, day out basis, I would recommend subscribing to my second YouTube channel, where I actually post daily vlogs of how I'm growing Social Wolf. If you want to build your own software, I would recommend joining the No Code Academy, where I help people like you build your first AI SaaS that is actually going to hit market and actually make money. So if you guys enjoyed this video, please hit this video with a like and subscribe. This was the Replit Agent Masterclass. It's your boy Kev. I'll see you on the next one.